This is Focal Point with Brian Fisher on AFR Talk. Listen to the audio podcast or download today's program at afr.net. You can also read Brian Fisher's columns at onenewsnow.com. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at any time at focalpoint@afr.net. Focalpoint@afr.net.
Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point with AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. The program is Focal Point. The network is AFR Talk, the American Family Radio Talk Network. Blast from the past, the 70s. I got a feeling somebody is watching. I'd like to bring in our special guest, Hans von Spakovsky. He is the Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Hans, welcome back to Focal Point with Brian Fisher. Want to get into something else entirely, but with all this stuff coming out about the NSA, I mean, do you have the same feeling that I do, that somebody is watching us?
Well, yes and no. I mean, look, what they are doing is they're collecting data and they're storing it. The one thing everybody should remember is that before they could actually go in and search any specific information, they still would have to go to a court and get a search warrant for it. If it's a national security issue, of course, that would be what they call the FISA court.
And I was reading a piece on Zero Hedge this morning about the amount of data about you that can be reconstructed just using this metadata, just by sort of analyzing who you've called, in what sequence you call a gynecologist, then you call Planned Parenthood. You know, it's pretty easy to put the pieces of that puzzle together. So there's a lot more information that they have access to maybe than people think when they're being told that, hey, it's just metadata, don't worry about that. Content of the calls is not a part of all of that. So anyway, well, let's turn to the subject that I wanted to talk with you about, Hans. It has to do with the piece that appeared on the Heritage Foundation's Foundry website this morning. You are a senior legal fellow there. And the title of the piece is Government's Shocking Interference in Ranchers' Life. And it's got a picture right at the top there of Wayne Hage, a farmer in Nevada. And the reason this really got my attention, Hans, is that I knew Wayne, and I knew his wife, Helen Chenoweth Hage. She was a former congressman from the state of Idaho. I knew her well when she was campaigning and serving as a congressman. Then she married Wayne, and she lived down there on the ranch, and I got to know him through her. So Wayne was actually, he was more of an acquaintance than a friend. Helen Chenoweth was a friend, but he was an acquaintance. So that just immediately grabbed my attention, and I sort of lost track with how this story had developed. And now it looks like perhaps the last chapter in this story of government tyranny has been written. But walk us through what the federal government did to this rancher.
It's a hugely long opinion, 104 pages by a federal district court, and it makes for long reading. But in essence, as you know, the Hage family has a big ranching operation, have a ranch out in Nevada. This area where they are has been a ranch since the 1860s, a very long time. And in essence, like a lot of ranchers, some of their cattle graze on federal lands, and they have had grazing permits also for a very long time. And back in 91, for really no reason, the Department of the Interior decided not to renew their permits. And the judge, in fact, says, I mean, the language he uses is quite something. It's what the government did shocks his conscience. They engaged in an intentional conspiracy. This is the judge saying this, to basically cancel their grazing permits and then to keep their cattle away from water, which, as you know, is really dangerous out in the West, but to keep them away from water to which they've had watering rights for, in some cases, more than 150 years.
Yeah, and I'm looking at your article here, Hans, and you write that some of this is actually quoting from the judge's opinion, that the Hages had vested stock watering rights, end quote, that went back as far as 1866 and 1874. So well over 100 years before the federal government came in, or this federal bureaucracy came in. And I think, didn't the judge refer to the BLM's action, Bureau of Land Management, as arbitrary and vindictive?
Oh, yeah, that's exactly it. And in fact, he ordered them to issue, finally, new grazing permits to the Hage family, and said, normally the Department of the Interior's got some discretion in this, and he said he wasn't going to allow them to have any discretion because of the animus that these Department of Interior people showed. In fact, he referred two of the witnesses in the case, who are government employees, to the U.S. Attorney's Office for possible prosecution, for potential obstruction of justice. Why? Because they kept sending trespass notices to other people who leased or sold cattle to the Hages in order to try to destroy the Hages cattle business, and also discourage them from testifying in this federal case.
And as I understand it, from what you write here, Hans, the grazing rights, for the Hage property went back before the whole BLM grazing permit program went into effect in 1934. They had grazing rights that predated that. They got wider rights that go back to the 19th century. And then apparently the BLM was so vindictive and so determined to put Wayne out of business, they actually built fences around some of the watering holes that his cattle needed for survival.
Yeah, in fact, when I was reading this part of the case, it reminded me of some of the great, old Western movies I've seen where, some big rancher, builds a fence to keep all the other ranchers away from his water, except in this case, it was the government doing that.
And they didn't they seize his cattle at one point? I'm actually going to take his cattle from him?
No, they seized his after the grazing permit expired. They started seizing his cattle and sold it. So they've still got a separate case going on for damages against the government. That's still, I think, going forward. But the main case here, which was started by the government, a civil trespass action, basically saying that the Hages cattle were trespassing on federal property. The government lost it, and they're going to get their permit back. But look, what this really shows is the kind of hostility that exists in the federal government against the traditional folks out west who, settled that area and are still there today. It's not just ranchers, but it's ranchers, miners, farmers, the federal government.
Loggers?
Yeah, loggers. The federal government has hostility towards them. Look, they would like to do what all these environmental groups want, which is to just return this area to purely environmental reasons, so nobody can do anything there, probably not even go hiking,
I had a story that I covered with our listening audience some time ago from the state of Oregon, which is very heavily, a small community there, very heavily dependent on logging revenue. And of course, back in the 90s, federal government said no more logging virtually on federal land, shut it down, because most of the forest where the logging was being done in that community was on national forest land. And so it shut down. It just closed off their primary stream of revenue for that little community. They kind of depended on that revenue, completely shut down. Federal government for a time said, okay, you can't get any money from revenue, and that's our fault because we're the federal government. We took it away from you. So we're going to supplement, we're going to give you kind of a subsidy to make up for the revenue that you've lost. So that went on for a decade or so, and then eventually they got tired of doing that, and now the federal government's not sending those subsidies in there. And here's a little town in Oregon, they've got no money, and they had to turn like 100 people loose from jail. Just had to turn them loose because they didn't have the money to pay to keep people incarcerated. So all these criminals walking around loose now in that Oregon town, because the federal government restricted access to natural resources.
Yeah, that's true. And, that it's decisions like that, too, that have led to some of the terrible fires that we've had in recent years in our national forests, because it's the thinning of forests, it's the cutting out of underbrush and other things, a lot of which is done by logging operations that in the past helped keep the forest clear and make the conditions such that when a fire occurred, it was controllable and not as bad. But those kind of bans, in fact, have made fires worse in the national forests.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions as we're bringing our time to a close here, talking here with Hans von Spakovsky, Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Hans, you know, I think what the government wants us to believe about these federal bureaucracies like the Environmental Protection Agency, like the Bureau of Land Management, is these are just impartial, they're just objective, they're not ideology-driven, they're just trying to do the best thing for the American people and follow the law. How accurate assessment is that?
That certainly was not my experience. I worked in two federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Election Commission, and I found that, look, there's no doubt there are some good civil service employees, but there are a lot of civil service employees who are very partisan, they're very ideological. Certain agencies attract them. I tell you, people, for example, who work at the EPA as government employees, I can tell you that if they were laid off there, where would they go to work? They would go to work for radical environmental organizations because that's the kind of ideological views that they have.
One last question. You know, Wayne Hage had some resources. He fought the government in court and eventually prevailed in this case. 20-year battle. This has been going on for 20 years now. And the federal government has spent who knows how many millions of dollars prosecuting him. And I got to think, Hans, this is the last thing I want you to comment on, about 60 seconds. It seems to me that most people would not have the resources or the willpower to resist the government for that long. They would just fold, and we may have no way of knowing how many people have just simply quietly and meekly gone out of business under this kind of bureaucratic tyranny.
No, that's exactly right. Look, the vast majority of people don't have the money and the resources to fight the federal government because the federal government is like a behemoth coming against you. It's almost impossible to fight them. And so the Hage family, that's just one case. I'm sure there are many, many more we don't hear about.
My guest has been Hans von Spakovsky. He is a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, has been a frequent guest here on Focal Point in the past. Always appreciate his expertise and perspective. Hans, thank you for making time in your busy schedule to chat with us today.
Brian, happy to do it.
Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation. You know, and I've got another case, another story I'll walk you through sometime about just a gross infringement of personal liberty by out-of-control federal bureaucracies driven by this kind of rigid and kind of mechanical environmental mindset. It'll curl the hair on your toes. Focal Point AFR Talk. We'll be right back after these brief messages. Stay with us.